Thank you to everyone for being here today. My plan is to provide some background and context on the 5th National Climate Assessment. I'm going to briefly cover some of the major themes of the draft report, and then I'm going to talk about how people can submit public comments. So I will cover those three things on this webinar and also on a second webinar planned for Thursday for later in the day at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm hoping to speak for something like 20 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time left over for questions at the end. Next slide, please. Can't see the next slide, but I'm hoping it's coming along. I'm coming to you today from the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. The USGCRP was codified in 1990 under the Global Change Research Act, and we are tasked with assisting the nation and the world in understanding, assessing, predicting, and responding to global change. The 13 federal member agencies you'll see down on the bottom of the screen there, those 13 members of the USGCRP are tasked with coordinating climate change research across the government and providing that information to decision makers who are facing risk management questions under a changing climate. And one of the most important ways in which we do this is through the National Climate Assessment, or NCA. You're going to hear me use that acronym a lot today. NCA is the National Climate Assessment. Next slide, please. To date, the U.S. Global Change Research Program has published 4 national climate assessments. The most recent one, NCA4, was released in 2018. So we are now in the process of developing the 5th National Climate Assessment, or NCA5, which is expected to be released by the end of 2023. Next slide, please. I always find it helpful to talk a little bit about what an assessment is, as it can be a little different from a scientific journal article or even another kind of government report that you might be familiar with. Many of the authors who write the NCA are researchers, but unlike a typical journal article, they are not being asked to conduct original research for the NCA. They are being asked to look across all of the information sources and weigh what is important and what we know. And they have to make hard choices about what rises to be included within their chapter and what doesn't. So it's more than just a literature review or a book report. The author teams must come to consensus on how confident we are in those findings and how likely the impacts will be under different scenarios. So by reporting not just what the impacts are, but how confident we are in those impacts, how likely they are to occur, an assessment like this is a risk management tool that can inform actions or policy. However, it does not prescribe or advocate for any specific policy. The National Climate Assessment is policy neutral and policy relevant. Next slide, please. A slow slide deck today. All right, our table of contents. So this is the table of contents for the 5th National Climate Assessment, or NCA5. If you look all the way out in the upper left corner, you'll see we start with an overview chapter, which is our executive summary, and that is followed by the 2nd and 3rd chapter of the report, which are physical science chapters. So we have a chapter on both observed and projected climate trends and one on changes in Earth system processes. The rest of the first column and the second column of chapters here are our national level chapters, which look at the impacts of climate change on a specific sector or a group of people at a national scale. This category includes 2 chapters that are new to NCA5. You'll see them highlighted in blue here. Those are the economics chapter and the human social systems chapter. The 3rd column here is the regional chapters. So we have 10 U.S. Global Change Research Program regions, And these chapters cover the entire breadth of impacts across all of those sectors and groups of people, but focused on regional and state and local levels within those regions. And finally, in the upper left corner, you'll see we have our 2 response chapters, adaptation and mitigation. Also new to NCA5 are 5 short features which were nominated by authors of NCA5, and they are on topics that span multiple chapters. And so they are also being written collaboratively by authors of multiple chapters. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So that was my background on the National Climate Assessment. Now I want to give you a little bit of a preview of some of the advances we've made in NCA5 and what is new about this report. So we are very lucky to be building off of the amazing work of the first 4 National Climate Assessments. In NCA5, we've added new chapters and features, which I just showed you on the previous slide. We've also amped up our public engagement for NCA5. We put our annotated outlines out for public comment earlier this year in January and February so that people could inform the scope and the approach of the chapters before a lot of the text was really baked into them. And we hosted 34 public engagement workshops where participants could speak directly to the authors about the things they care about and how the report can be made more useful to them. We asked our authors to think very early and often about figures and encourage them to leverage the power of art and storytelling when developing their chapters. I will circle back at the end of my presentation to give you some more information about our public call for art. We have a really nice, diverse set of authors writing this assessment. We have almost 500 authors and 200 technical contributors that come from every state in the United States, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. And this mix of federal and non-federal authors represents a really wide range of expertise and experience, and a nice range in career stage as well, from students all the way to retirees. We are also working right now to update our guidance to those authors on information quality and how to better incorporate Indigenous knowledge into NCA5, but also future NCAs. The next one on this list here is probably only something that process wonks like me love, but I can happily report that we have improved upon what was already a gold standard for transparency and documentation in NCA5. So for example, we've updated our processes for collecting the metadata behind every figure of the assessment. We are continuously working to improve inclusion and accessibility in the NCA development process. So this includes things like instituting the first code of conduct for NCA participants, providing training to our authors on topics like Indigenous knowledge and environmental justice. We had a live translation of our Caribbean chapters workshop, and the 3rd order draft of the Caribbean chapter is also available in Spanish. And we've made some improvements in our 508 accessibility considerations as well. Finally, we are only at the beginning stages of building our NCA5 website right now for the launch next year, but we're already considering how we can make sure this site is more navigable so that people can find the information they need more efficiently. Next slide, please. So that was advances in our development process. If I were to tell you all about the scientific advances that have occurred since NCA4 that are included in this report, I would probably be here all day. But I thought I would touch on 3 main categories here. The first is that we have an improved understanding of Earth system processes. So for example, we have reduced uncertainty in our understanding of climate sensitivity, or how sensitive the climate is to greenhouse gas concentrations. We've also come a really long way in attribution science, or the ability to look at one specific extreme weather event and say how much more frequent or how much more severe that event was due to climate change. That science has advanced quite a bit over the last few years. Scientists also have a greater understanding of how people are experiencing climate change, including how many communities are experiencing disproportionate impacts. or where climate change is exacerbating existing inequities. This report looks at how those impacts can cascade or ripple through interconnected systems like supply chains to have an even greater effect on our health and our economy, on disaster recovery, or things like national security. And finally, and importantly, we have also made some strides in the social sciences and increased documentation of proven climate solutions. So we have more examples of where communities have already taken action to reduce the worst harms from climate change and protect the things they value most. We have cost-effective mitigation and adaptation options that are available right now that can help our country rapidly transition how we power our homes and our schools and our businesses. So now I have 3 slides for you here where I want to talk about the 5 major themes that are outlined in our overview chapter, or our executive summary. And I think this is a helpful way to get a quick overview of the entire report in a short amount of time, though of course much more detailed information can be found in the underlying chapters. So the overview chapter and the whole report starts out by talking about how people across the United States are already taking those actions to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And this might be a bit different than the storyline you've seen in previous reports, which starts out with humans are emitting greenhouse gases, which are concentrating in our atmosphere, which is leading to warming, which is resulting in physical impacts to our Earth, which is resulting in social impacts on things like our health and our economy, that sort of causal chain. This first section of the report certainly notes that every bit of additional warming and every action we take to reduce each increment of that warming matters. But I think it also demonstrates how the conversation of climate change has advanced in this country by beginning this report right off the bat, talking about what we are doing about climate change. The second part of the overview talks about how people are experiencing climate change right now, right outside their window. And right now, a major way that people are experiencing climate change is through extreme events. So this section talks a lot about extreme weather and especially the increase in compound or cascading extreme events. Another way that people are experiencing climate change right now is through those disproportionate impacts I mentioned, especially to frontline and overburdened communities. So this section describes some of the inequitable impacts of climate change. It also talks about the distribution of impacts across the United States. So we know that climate change is affecting every part of the US, but we also know that those impacts can differ depending on where you live. So this section looks at some of the impacts of greatest concerns to different regions all around the country. Next slide, please. Section 3 of our overview, which is the largest section, looks at the things that Americans value most and how climate change is putting those things at risk. So this section covers things like impacts on water, food, shelter, impacts to infrastructure and critical services. From there, it looks at the climate effects on our human health and our ecosystems, and then our economy, our livelihood, jobs, and finally impacts on our culture, heritage, and traditions. So while this section explores how all of these things that we value are at risk because of climate change, it also includes discussion of opportunities for mitigation and adaptation actions that can protect all of these things we value most. Next slide, please. Section 4 of the overview is looking forward. So this is the section where you will see how the different choices that society makes today can lead to different emission pathways, and how those different emission pathways can lead to different levels of global warming, and what kind of impacts we can expect under those different levels of global warming. Finally, the fifth and the last section of the overview kind of mirrors that first section in a way. So you'll remember the first section talked about mitigation and adaptation actions that communities are already taking around the country. This section talks about how we move forward, so that gap from where we are now and where we need to be to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. This section describes how mitigation and adaptation actions can result in both near-term and systemic cascading benefits. And it demonstrates how transformative changes provide us an opportunity for a safer, healthier, and more just nation. Next slide. So all of this brings me to the third section of my talk, which is about how you can still be a part of NCA5. So we have held a number of public engagement opportunities along the way, along our path for development, and we are currently in the middle of an open public comment period on the third order draft of our report. Public input is a really important part of the NCA development process, and it's also an opportunity for you to partake in some civic engagement and be part of the United States scientific assessment on climate change. Next slide, please. So I strongly encourage all of you to submit public comments on the draft NCA5. This is one of the most effective ways to be part of the NCA process, and the authors write a response to every single comment received. So we really want to hear from you. Does this report meet the needs of your community? Are there things that should be prioritized or deprioritized? Is the science that we are explaining in this assessment clear? Are we communicating the science effectively? And if you are an expert in a scientific field, are we accurately representing that field? So we really want to hear from you between now and the end of January. The deadline is January 27th, 2023. Your comments help strengthen the NCA and make sure that this isn't just a report that sits on a shelf and gathers dust somewhere. This is a report that is useful to you and your communities. And if that wasn't enough to convince you, I will also mention that this is your last chance to provide feedback on the 5th National Climate Assessment before the final version is published next year. So I gave you the who, what, when, and where on this slide. If you'll go to the, sorry, I gave you the who, what, when, and why on this slide. If you go to the next slide, I will give you the where, the all-important where to submit public comments. You can submit public comments at our review and comment portal, which can be found at review.globalchange.gov. You will need to log into the site, or if you are submitting a comment for the first time, you'll need to create an account and then log in. The good news is that we use this same platform for all public comments on our assessments and products, so next time it'll be even easier. If you'll go to the next slide, please. Got some more helpful tips here. So submitting a public comment is not difficult, but there are a number of steps involved. So if you need more help on how to navigate this process, we've created a short 1-minute video on how to submit a public comment. We also have a longer step-by-step guide with nice screenshots of this site that will walk you through the process. So those resources are available on our Open Notices webpage or at the QR code shown here. When you do log into the review.globalchange.gov website, there are also instructions on that page above our table of contents of all of the chapters. So you can see the instructions again there as well. Next slide. I think I've just got 2 more slides left here, but I wanted to give a few tips, especially for those who may be new to submitting public comments. Especially if you're completely new to the National Climate Assessment at all, I think the first tip is for you. My talk provided a little bit of background and context on NCA, but if you need more information on what the report covers and what it doesn't, or what states make up each of the NCA regions, or what climate scenarios we're using in this assessment, the front matter can help answer those questions for you and help you focus your comments. The second tip here is just good practice, that if you identify a concern, it's always helpful to offer a solution as well. The third tip on the slide is one that's really important to our authors. So every chapter has a word limit, which means that each author team has to make really tough choices about what to include in their chapter and what not to include. On a side note, I think this is part of the value of the National Climate Assessment. It isn't just a giant summary of all of the literature that's out there. It really provides the readers with the most important information that is the most critical for Americans facing climate risks right now. But this does mean that the authors have limited space and they have to prioritize. So it's also okay to submit comments on what could be cut as well as what could be added. In that vein, you can comment on the scientific content, of course, but also on how the report can be made more useful to you. So if there's something that is unclear, please let us know. All the scientific content in the world is great, but if we're not communicating it effectively, then we're not doing our job. And finally, it's important to remember that all of our authors who are volunteering their time and energy on this assessment to go through hundreds and hundreds of comments. So first things, keep it classy. And second, know that the authors can't see who is submitting the comments. So writing things like, see my previous comment or building on my previous point, that sort of thing won't work because the authors can't see who wrote each one and won't be able to connect one comment to another. So the commenters' names are anonymous at this stage, but all of the comments with the commenters' names and each response will be made public upon release of the report. Next slide, please. So this is my last one before I open it up to Q&A, and hopefully a fun one as well. I wanted to talk about one more public engagement opportunity that we have going on right now. There we go. This is our open call for art. So we have a project called Art Times Climate, which was announced in October. And this is an open call for art. There's one for youth ages 13 to 17 and one for adults age 18 and above. This open call for art runs the same time period of our public comment period. So this also ends January 27th, 2023. And we're really looking for pieces of art that connect to the themes of the chapter topics of the National Climate Assessment. And we're hoping to use selected pieces in the assessment itself or in some of our communication materials as well. So all of you talented artists out there, please take a picture of this QR code, and we're looking forward to seeing the creative works of art that you submit.